I wrote a book on Darwin, and it came out in 2014, and as I was researching it beyond my own biography, because I'm born and bred, I was really struck by the fact that this is a garrison town in sleeper guise, and the reason that it is reinvented serially after 4 destructions is argued on the basis of its necessity for strategic defence purposes. And yet when I explored that with just on a vox pop basis, I was told one of 2 things. One is I was making it up, and the second one was, what else would you have Australia do or be? So it was either imagined or it was absolutely necessary and unquestionable. So on the basis of removing it out of this kind of quandary between we can't talk about it or it's invisible to us, I'm really grateful to Kirsty and the team for making it a prime piece of the conversation as we think about our current and future in the north. In this place, Garramilla, the rhythms of everyday life, hanging out for the reprieve of the monsoon, hanging out for the ease of the dry, hanging out for the mangoes, is increasingly shaped by another kind of build-up, and that's the steady escalation of 2 things that are entirely related: extractivism and militarism. Here, unlike down south, military personnel, camouflage-painted road convoys, the thunder of aerial training exercises, media boosterism around the region's strategic significance on rinse and repeat, and more furtively, revelations of environmental damage and toxic legacies are woven into the fabric of our everyday life, to the point where to raise questions about what it is all for makes the questioner the weird one. This place we are in, however, as I say, is sculpted by defence. The people sent here to take lands, to still water, and to secure white settlements were soldiers and convicts who were policed by soldiers. This town was destroyed mostly by cyclones, but also by aerial raids after Pearl Harbor, then Darwin. And each time, rebuild is premised on geostrategy. So much of what we are surrounded by has a military signature. The first dam for drinking water was installed by the military. The Stuart Highway was even called Australia's Burma Road because it was completed by American and Australian soldiers working with civilians. The airport is actually a military asset, and it's leased to civilians for civilian purposes, but at any time can be returned for military purposes, and its width and depth is sufficient for bombing aircraft. It's its primary purpose. And you can fly over the ordnance. And what that airport sits underneath is one of the world's largest aerial training grounds. Now, of course, well before becoming a lily pad for the Pentagon's pivot to Asia, Darwin was an important part of the global technological security apparatus when, back in the 1950s, mining began at Rum Jungle. Back then, it was to supply uranium to the British and American nuclear weapons program. And for years, like countrymen in Western Australia being bathed in asbestos, for years people would, just citizens, locals, would swim in the pit of that old mine, taken there on school excursions, little camps, unaware that all biota for 15 kilometres down the Finniss River had already been destroyed, and over 100 square kilometres of surrounding floodplains contaminated. It shocks, but then also doesn't really surprise, to learn of PFAS contamination and leaking silos in the present moment. Even the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, which came up yesterday, has a military signature in that caveat that activities on Indigenous lands that serve the national purpose can override any mining vetoes. Well, the opportunity to have a mining veto was also clipped very early in the piece, but when it was still there, it already had an override system. And as the USA is currently also reminding us, the military can also be the police, can also be the carceral complex, Another signature to remember in a place where Indigenous people are so radically overrepresented in the justice system. So this is why we're having this session. Today we'll be exploring different aspects of everyday militarism with short presentations from each speaker. So to launch our session is James Shirley, a climate justice campaign specialist with Jubilee Australia Research Centre, who'll take us through arguments linking Australia's commitment to fossil fuel industries and the linking of that with matters of national defence. Then he's going to pass like a swift antelope to Dave Sweeney, who, as we heard yesterday, is a renowned anti-nuclear campaigner and member of the Australian Conservation Foundation, who will remind us about the connection between peace and ecological survival and help us understand what is AUKUS about really. Mia Pepper comes to us from the Conservation Council of Western Australia to discuss the greenwashing of critical minerals, which is very timely given that the Australian government's big signature on the environment is to get us to all use e-vehicles. The greenwashing of critical minerals, revealing their importance simultaneously in defence hardware. And then, last but certainly not least, Professor Catherine Gilby, an Arawa woman connected to Central Australia as well, academic and author, who'll delve into the lived truth of everyday militarism from policy to punishment. So, James.
All right, strap yourselves in whilst I try and keep this to 5 minutes. So I want to reference Mark Ogg's presentation yesterday. Mark was talking about the imperative for fossil fuel phase-out campaigns to win that economic argument. In my experience, I think by and large as a movement, we have been gaining the upper hand over the past few years in proving that fossil fuels are not good for the Australian economy and that they don't stimulate the sorts of jobs that they claim to. What I have seen in my advocacy and what we've seen at Jubilee is a fossil fuel lobby pivoting to the one thing that is more important in a Western paradigm than the economy, which is national security. We first started seeing this in direct meetings with government officials, and then this quickly started sort of rolling out in the Australian media, particularly by Japanese government officials talking about, well, I guess drawing the link between Australia's gas exports and the need to expand Australia's gas exports with the security and the military partnerships between countries like Australia and Japan. So why Japan is so important in this context. Japan is the largest customer of Australian gas. We published this report a couple of months ago with our friends at ACF and the Fossil Free Japan Coalition. We've still got a couple of copies out there. I won't go into too much detail about the report, but we found that between 2008 and 2024, the South Korean and Japanese governments poured a combined $20 billion into Australian gas. There are Australian gas projects like Barossa, which may not have been financially viable without this crucial investment on the part of these countries. Japan's investment in Australian gas is incredibly important for Japan. It's a small island nation, it does not have its own natural resources, and it's got a very large emissions-intensive economy. So the supply of gas to Japan will always be has always been a very important issue in Japanese foreign affairs. However, what our research has found is that Japan is over-contracting its imports of gas. Around 30% of the gas contracted by Japanese firms is not actually burnt in Japan, it's resold around Asia. And this is a very deliberate strategy on the part of the Japanese government, in concert with Japanese corporations, to build out this huge network of LNG infrastructure, starting with export terminals and wells up here in the top end, right through to other terminals, power plants all around Asia, in part to grow Japan's soft power in the region. Successive Australian governments, this is a very bipartisan issue for the major parties, successive Australian governments are enabling this and are benefiting from it with increased military drills between Japanese and Australian military forces and obviously the expansion of military assets and bases across the top end. So could I just get a show of hands, all the Sydney-siders in the room? Cool. There's a couple of you. Have you ever seen 11 tanks of jet fuel along Sydney Harbour? I haven't. And any Melbourne folk in the room? Yeah. Yeah, okay, a lot of you. Are there any tanks of jet fuel along the Yarra? No. So these military assets that have been developed across the top end, I think by and large do not make people in the top end feel safer, and for very good reason. So in the context of the top end, I want to leave you with one provocation. The gas industry is claiming that its expansion is in service to Australia's national security. Do we think this is the case, or do we think that our national security is actually being compromised in order to fuel the expansion of Australian gas? And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I really want to start, particularly like Tess said, Darwin is a garrison town, and the whole promotion of the military in the north and in northern Australia. I want to first start as a southern activist in this space, just shouting out the hard work and the hard yards done by the northerners who are on the front line of this. And I don't make a point of sort of naming individuals, but I do want to name Justin Tuddy in Darwin, Jonathan Pilbrow in the centre, in Alice. Both of those have forged links down south that keep us in some degree of touch. I've got a short period of time, 5 minutes. That's 4 minutes 59, longer than Richard Marles has ever spoken in public about AUKUS. 5 minutes to tell you about AUKUS. 4 years ago this week, our nation was ambushed by then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who, without evidence, consultation, announced that we were signing up for the AUKUS nuclear deal. Now, it was a highly politicised time, and Labor were looking at election in the next 6 months, and they were petrified of the wedge that this was. They were petrified they would be painted every day in the Murdoch press as soft on defence. So in 24 hours, with scant evidence, Labor agreed to this. And they agreed to it without any caveats or conditions. And they have aggressively prosecuted it since. There have been multiple off-ramps, as they say, multiple opportunities to exit AUKUS, which make perfect sense, and they haven't. They need to. In 2021, the head of Navy, when PM Morrison announced AUKUS, said that it was a decision that would change the shape of our nation. Our biggest ever spend, defence spend, and it would change the shape of our nation. It was decided and advanced in secret. It's argued that it is there to defend democracy, and yet it is profoundly, at every essence, hostile to the fundamentals of democracy, to transparency, evidence, discourse, scrutiny. It risks nuclear-capable B-52s in Katherine. Yesterday, Sam Phelan painted a picture of Katherine in 3 minutes that made Wake in Fright look like a golden book. It was really powerful, really potent, and really there. And how, for one instance, would the presence of US Air Force nuclear-capable bombers based in that town make that any better? It risks the waters and the ports and the port communities, particularly at HMAS Stirling and the Henderson Military Precinct, south of Freo. Last Sunday, Richard Marles and PM Albanese announced a $12 billion public money spend, which includes a dry dock, to enable lifting out of US and UK nuclear subs for significant maintenance. Not cleaning the dials, significant maintenance. That is an escalation beyond which this country has ever had. It is the permanent housing of US and UK nuclear-powered submarines, and the government, Foreign Minister Penny Wong, has accepted American nuclear ambiguity, the point of we do not confirm or deny. Now, we have a right to know with a K-N-O-W, and we have a right and a responsibility to say no with an N and an O. The other thing, just as an aside, we're in a housing crisis. That announcement on Sunday is fast-tracking housing for 1,000 US submarine personnel. in WA. This AUKUS also means radioactive waste, forever waste, high level, military grade, highly enriched uranium waste, forever waste. We've fought this in this room, around this country for years, and this is opening a poison porthole. Now, one positive thing, in the initial legislation that came in, it was open to take UK and US high-level waste and military waste without qualification. A group of people, organisations and activists, and I've got to give a shout out to the Greens, to Senator David Shoebridge for advanced work, stopped that and got that constrained back to Australian waste. But there's still wriggle room, and as we know in this room, especially the fact that our AUKUS partners with 60 years in this game, civil and military, do not have disposal pathways, do not have solutions, there will continue to be, like there has in the past and there will be again in the future, those who see this country as radioactive terra nullius, or as the theme of, or one of the themes of this conference is a sacrifice zone. And on that note, I want to put one place on your radar, which is Chandler, the Chandler project near Titchakala, south of Alice Springs, where a low-level waste disposal management company from WA has got together and cut a deal with a high security clearance US military contractor. The low level is Talus, the high level is Amentum, and they're going to co-develop, this is their plan, a deep geological waste site in Central Australia near Chandler. They are bullishly now promoting that they have the capacity to manage AUKUS waste and future arising civilian radioactive waste. So eternal vigilance, folks, is our thing. Now, in our quest as a nation, Australia's quest, and it's not the Australian people, it's certainly not the First Peoples, in Australia's quest and obsession to obtain nuclear vessels, we run the absolute risk of becoming a nuclear vassal. And that is a really disturbing prospect. It's a new generation of nuclear colonisation, and we cannot let that happen without a fight. We first of all can't let it happen, and we second, at least without a red-hot fight. And also there is grounds to fight, not just because it's the right thing to do and essential and for our future and protecting, and it represents the values of peace and sustainability and everything that's sane. But it's also time to fight because right now, AUKUS is enormously vulnerable. Trump is erratic. The costs and the overruns are massive. People aren't convinced. Social licence is not secured. There are technical roadblocks in both UK and US production streams. There are a whole range of points, and this is a house of cards. With the wind in the right direction could fall over. So let's do our best to make that house of cards collapse, because while AUKUS is an extraordinarily bad deal, it is not a done deal. So let's do what we can. Thank you.
I'm really glad, Dave, that you brought up so many of the things that are happening in WA with Henderson Defence Precinct, the radioactive waste, Telus Holdings, who's based in Sydney. So for Sydney-siders, their headquarters are there, though they're causing havoc in WA and NT. But I was just going to click through this pretty quickly to talk about critical minerals, because you might have heard a new wave of government promotion around critical minerals mining, and I just wanted to break down a little bit what that means. Critical minerals is a political construct. It's not a neat package of minerals, and the political construct really has two key factors: how important it is for technology or the economy, and then supply scarcity, so where a mineral is really dominated by one country. And so we need rare earths and mineral sands and lithium, aluminium, a whole range of minerals for electric vehicles, renewable energy, and that's sort of what the government has really couched as: we need more money for critical minerals. When you get that status as a mineral, it opens up the door to government funding. And that's really significant because it means that you're opening the door to projects that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be economically viable, and with that comes a whole lot of risks around legacy mines and how they clean up, how well they meet their environmental guidelines. The growth in critical minerals is really big. A couple of years ago we heard it was all about renewable energy and electric vehicles and mining for the transition, and there was this diversification of our economy to support green growth and renewable energy. What's sitting underneath that, and what's really coming to the fore now, is the role of critical minerals in defence and militarisation. For this presentation, I caught up on the latest resource quarterly from the chief economist, which a couple of years ago was talking about renewable energies and growth. There was not a single mention of renewables in this quarterly. It was all about defence, and it pointed to the increase in global spending on defence. It noted that defence makes up 10% of demand for critical minerals currently, and looked at the opportunity for growth. $2.7 trillion global investment in defence, and that's set to grow, with NATO going from 2% of GDP to 5%, the EU having an $8 billion Euro fund, and Japan increasing their spending to 2%. So this is driving a significant amount of excitement from the Australian government, which tells you where their thinking is at around how we can capitalise on defence trade. It's looking at where all these minerals are coming from. This shows the 12 critical mineral partnerships that Australia has. This really closely resembles all of our military alliances, and that's not by accident. This is the critical mineral construct is around making friends and where these military partnerships and alliances lie, and that's coming through with the critical mineral partnerships. It's who are our friends, who are we aligning ourselves to, and I think probably if we looked at gas, it might even be similar too, James. That's what critical minerals are named in Australia. I wanted to point out two companies, Lynas and Iluka. One of the biggest sort of critical mineral areas of excitement is rare earths, and that China has dominated that industry for a very long time until Lynas came along. They're a Perth-based company, and they mine out at Mount Weld in Laverton, which is one of the poorest areas in WA. When you look at the social economic index out there, it's devastating. That community is living right next to this mine, and it's producing rare earths that are shipped out through Fremantle to a place called Kuantan in Malaysia, where they do the cracking and leaching and processing of rare earths, and it's the first place outside of China where they're doing this. So Lynas have kind of broken the Chinese market, and now they're getting things like contracts with the US Department of Defense to take that technology to Texas, so that US is breaking into that market too. So they're a really interesting company in that way. They got in so much trouble in Malaysia because they weren't managing their waste, and rare earths produces uranium as a byproduct. That's a waste stream. And in Kuantan, Malaysia, they were in a lot of trouble with the Malaysian government for failing to manage that waste. We now have that part of the process, what's called cracking and leaching in Kalgoorlie, again, where there's huge inequalities in the community, there's a huge water take, and the radioactive waste is sitting there for 2 years before they want to return it to the mined out pit in Laverton. Iluka is another one. They got a $1.2 billion loan from the Australian government, and the minerals that they've been targeted to process all have military applications. It's no accident that these companies are getting these big contracts from government, big loans and investment, because this isn't about renewables, this is about defence. A lot of these minerals have not been economically viable, but they also sit in waste streams. So one of the biggest rare earth deposits in Australia is the tailings at Olympic Dam, but also throughout other parts of Australia, these products haven't been mined before. And there's a huge opportunity, I think, and Gavin Mudd, who many of you will know, has done an incredible piece of work with Geoscience Australia mapping Australia's mine waste. And the economic value of that. And so rather than remining, rather than opening the door to new mines for renewable energies, if we can be really targeted, I think there's a huge opportunity to remine that waste, to rehabilitate those sites, because many of them are sitting there abandoned. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
When we talk about militarisation of the North, when we talk about the Northern Territory, we must never forget that the Australian government sent the Australian Army into Aboriginal communities. We seem to think that is kind of, it's in the past, it's not relevant now. And I'm just going to talk to you really quickly about why it is relevant now, because they sent the Army in to do sexual health checks on 6-year-olds. I thank God that never actually got up. That didn't actually ever, that got stopped, but it was thought about. It was tried to put into practice. So we sit and now we go, oh, look, isn't it terrible that the National Guard is being sent into American cities that We have no moral high ground whatsoever. The Australian government sent in the army to Australian Aboriginal communities. So I just want to let that sit, because when we talk about militarisation, we have to also talk about they did that as the start of the Northern Territory emergency response. So they did what is known as the intervention. The intervention. And I pontificate on the fact now that there are no children who in the Northern Territory. It's been 18 years. There are no children who haven't grown up and been brought up within these really strict, restrictive policies. And I feel the need to keep talking about this. My name is Catherine Gilby. My country is northeast of Alice Springs up into far western Queensland. I remember when this started to happen. I remember all the quiet, hushed voices like, surely this can't be possible. They can't do this. We have mechanisms in place. We have rights. What are you talking about? And the mechanisms that we have for enforcing human rights is through legislation. And just like that, on the back of a stack of lies, they removed the Racial Discrimination Act. Oh, this is past history. What's it got to do with now? It's got everything to do with now. Just like that, the RDA was eliminated. Our only mechanism to protect our rights. I'm going to pivot quickly and then I'm going to come back. I was teaching a class up in the top end here, maybe 3 weeks after the intervention rollout had happened, and there was this teacher, and she was in top end communities, and she was small in stature, huge in power. When the army went into her classroom, she was just like, out, get out. And she went at the front and she just stripped a switch as she went out the front. And she stood there, this woman, this tiny woman. And North Force was there and the army was there. And she just said, you're not coming into my classroom. She went like that. North Force ran away. There was no way they were going to get whipped. Then the Australian army was standing there like, and she's like, you're not coming in. And she hunted them away too. So then I'm going to pivot again. So does everyone know what North Force is? So North Force is protecting the North. And one thing that I will say with certainty is that there's nobody who knows how to strategically defend better than the traditional owners. And so North Force, the Ranger program, they're all under threat, funding threat, constant funding threat. When we know that they work, we know if you want to strategically defend this country, you get the traditional owners and you use Aboriginal knowledge to do it. We know that that works. So that's my pivot there. And it's a shout out for like North Force and Ranger programs and anything that uses the old knowledge that exists in this country. There is no one who knows better how to strategically defend than the traditional owners of that land. There was also an old man, so Mavis, that teacher, then at an Amongana, as the trucks were rolling in, just the passenger trucks, they weren't tanks, but they were those army carrier trucks. One old man stood at the single entrance into Amongana and he just went like that. And 3 of those trucks were backed up. How do we know this? He was just like, no, you're not coming in. How do we know this? Through word of mouth. It's reminiscent of Tiananmen Square. Remember that photo from Tiananmen Square when that one man was standing in front of that tank? It brings that up in my mind, but there's no international media there. There's no one there taking a photo of his quiet stand, of Mavis's quiet stand, because there's no national outcry, because there's no international outcry, because there's no one who seems to be actually caring about this. So those hushed, quiet whispers that we had, that surely this can't be possible, and then it is, and then they did, and then we go, hold on a second, what's going on here? And then we go, where's the national outcry? But then we see all the lies that were talked about Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. We have all of those pixelated faces with the whistleblowers and the rivers of grog and the pedophile rings that were all lies that have never been debunked, have never been nationally come out and said, these were lies. This whole thing was based on lies. So do you know that you guys who are from the East Coast? It was for you. All of the late line, Channel 7, every single little broadcast, it was for you so that you could tolerate what was happening to us. It was for you that these shows were created so that you could be like, ooh, didn't know how bad it was up there. That's okay. Ooh, lucky the government stepped in like they did. That's okay. All of this is designed to manipulate you. For the first time ever, I saw two international commentators draw a direct line between, like, to talk about Australia, what happened. Do you know, the pain of the referendum is a real and ongoing thing, and we haven't actually looked at that. But then I saw on this podcast, it was like YouTube, I think, and it was the Greek finance minister talking with Mehdi Hassan, and I'd actually fallen asleep on the couch, and I woke up when they were talking about Australia. So I'm just going to read this little bit. The question was, why are so many of the outlet-owning tech lords like Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg so invested in anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel speech? Why is this? And he gives some examples that they've come out of, you know, white supremacist South Africa, that Europe is a hotbed of this. But then he says, if you think, what did the British do when they approached the southeastern coast of Australia in 1788? They looked at the large continent of Australia, where there were about 6 million natives living. That's him, Giannis, talking. They declared it a terra nullius, a land without a people. That's what it means, an empty land. And they said, okay, it's ours. That's the first step to genocide. And then he goes on to say the Germans in Namibia. And then he says, there is a tradition of genocide. Therefore, think of the Zionist slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. So we are looking at the Palestinians and they're not people. And this is a land without a people, so it's ours. And that's the first step to genocide, to say that this is a land without a people. And then he says, look at Australia and Australians. 2 years ago, there was a puny little referendum that, had it passed, it would have given the surviving natives, the Aborigines, it would have given the right to have a committee that could advise Parliament on matters concerning the native Australians. And the white Australian and immigrant populations voted convincingly against it because they know. And then he goes, they don't know. It's in their subconscious that there hasn't been equality. But if they acknowledge at all the need for equality, that there hasn't been equality, and then they have to accept that they live on stolen land. And that was the first time I had heard an international commentator draw a direct line like that. It's not the ignorance itself that's the problem. Because the ignorance can be tackled with education, it can be tackled with honest conversations, it can be tackled with truth-telling. It really is the possessive investment in that ignorance. The active fighting against equality, the active ignoring against atrocities, that is the problem, because people cannot accept that if there was equality, if there was a voice to the Parliament, that perhaps they would have to recognise that they're living on stolen land. And that is just too big of a jump. And I was like, how are these international people talking about this? And we're kind of not. It is by design that we are fed a narrative that allows us to tolerate the intolerable. It's by design that the intervention was allowed to happen and everyone just kind of said, okay. Because we were demonised so much. And then we get to a place to tolerate the intolerable. Then we get to a place where 100% of the children locked up in Dondale are Aboriginal. We get to a place where, because it's happening about children now, it's the same process. Oh, these kids are so naughty, these kids are running amok, these children, these are children. And we get to the place where the intolerable, the unconscionable, that 10-year-olds can be considered criminally responsible for their actions and locked up in a jail. That is insane. And nowhere else would that make sense. But we've just been fed all of this that makes that seem like it's a normal thing. We accept the really restrictive rules of the intervention now because it's been 18 years. It was supposed to, stronger futures. How dare they name it Stronger Futures when it was never designed to give us stronger futures? We just accept that there's police at the bottle shop in Alice Springs. You know, we just go. I just want to come back to one point, which is, and it's going to touch on Dave's point. So, because what Yanis also talked about is terra nullius, and we don't actually have the conversation about what is the today effects of terra nullius. How is it played out today? And so, A, it's a denying of humanity, a complete denying of any form of humanity. But terra nullius is felt today, and we still don't have that conversation. There's no treaty. There's no recognition of sovereignty, and there's no recognition of humanity. And so Dave's talking about Chandler, and it blows my mind because it's terra nullius again, this big, brown, empty land. It's not true. We have to stand up and say it's simply not true. And we have to do that for sort of across the board. So this is how terra nullius plays out today, right now, in the mining of uranium, because it's empty land, in these offerings of spaces for war games to happen. Can you see that there's a direct link towards we won't even call it like the original sin, but there's a book that says One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar El-Akkad. And it really is about the way that we just turn a blind eye. So I could have said nothing about Gaza because, you know, it's really risky. I could have said nothing about Palestine and drawn no line between. But, you know, those children are being killed. And I can't just be quiet about it. It's not something that I can just be silent about. And because, as I hope that I've just shown, is when everything was silent about what was happening here, and now we just consider it normal, the intervention, living under those rules. And no child exists in the Northern Territory that hasn't grown up within them, seeing their parents disrespected constantly. Like there's a whole long list. Finally, including compassion, nothing is absolutist. We can recognise the humanity, pain and suffering of one group without having to deny another's. We must never forget. We must never continue to keep doing it. And we just can't be silent in the face of all of this brutality.